All right, hello, welcome back to Tech Teacher Support. I am Chris, and this is part 4 of Let's Build an App. And today we're going to pick up where we left off, and that is, as you can see on the screen, we are going to add some sliders to our ColorMixer app. So if you're just joining us, this is again part 4, and we are building our first app over here on our iPad, and we are following along to this book, Intro to App Development with Swift. You can find that on the Apple Bookstore. It is free, and it takes you through the fundamentals of the Swift programming language. And we went right to chapter 17, and we're building our first app. And we are using a Macintosh app called Xcode to do that. And so let me flip over here to Xcode. And here on the screen, you can see this is what we're building and coding the app in. So we're switching back and forth between that and the book. We also have over here our iPad, and again we have that connected to our laptop with a cable, so we are able to build our app on the screen and then send it over here and run it, and we can interact with it and make sure it works just how we want. So what we're going to be doing is continuing to pick up where we left off here in Xcode, and that is with sliders. So make sure you see parts 1 through 3 to catch up to where we're at, and I'm going to pull up our big screen right here, and I'm going to go back to the book. Let's talk a little bit about what's happening. So what we've done so far is we've added that color view, that UI view, that box, and then we've added a few switches, to make that box turn different colors. What we need to do now is get a little more precision so we can get even more colors, because right now we're limited to just 8. But we want to have fine control over the shades of red, green, and blue. So we're going to add these sliders in, and that's going to let you get very precise on the color that you want. So as you can see, we're going to move our switches over a little bit, add some sliders in, and then we're going to have to write some code to say, what do those sliders do? Okay. So first thing it says here, and we're just going to drop right onto this page, it says you need to make some room for the sliders. You need to scooch them over here to the left and add those in, and that's what we're going to do, is add in the sliders here. Okay, so it's just kind of giving you a few different ways you can move those around. So let's drop over to Xcode. All right. I'm going to zoom in here. Here again is our iPad screen, and it has our view and our 3 switches. This is probably a little trickier to do on an iPhone because you're really limited with your width, but on an iPad we have a ton of room to do this. But what it wants us to do is move those switches over to make room for the sliders. And one way you can do that so that you move them all at the same time is you can click your mouse and drag a box around them. What you notice happens is all 3 of them are selected. Then if you click one and move it, it's going to move all 3 of those together, right? It's much easier than trying to just move one at a time and make sure they're all lined up. So what I'm going to do again is draw a box around those, and then we're just going to move those over here to the side. And that looks about right. And again, you can put these anywhere you want. The code won't change depending on where they're at. So even though we've already written the code, you can put those buttons anywhere on the screen and they'll work just fine, those switches. So we're going to move those switches over there. What it's also giving you is some pointers on how to space those. So if we click on a switch and use our arrow keys down here on our keyboard, you notice that 1 pixel at a time that moves it up or down. If you hold your shift key as you do this, you're going to move it 10 pixels at a time. And that lets you kind of space these out a little bit better. So what it's asking you to do in the book is to click the top one and the bottom one, hold shift, and just give them a little more space, right? Just give them a little breathing room in there. And in fact, this one looks like it's not centered. Further in the chapter, you can learn a lot more about layout and alignment and making it look the same on every single device. But for this project, let's just eyeball it. That looks good. We've moved those over enough. let's see what the book says. Okay. Select all three switches, drag them to the left, select the top switch, bottom switch, space them apart. And what it's saying is, remember, you're using your finger or your thumb to hit these switches, whereas on your computer, you're using your mouse. So it's much easier on your computer in precision with your mouse. But when we're using our big goofy fingers, you want a lot of space around each interactive element, so we're not accidentally clicking other switches or sliders. So that's what it's telling you to do. Now what we need to do is add a slider. So right down here, it says find a slider in the object library and drag it onto the scene. Using the guides, align it vertically with the top switch and horizontally within the scene. Okay, so we're getting pretty good at this. We know how to add objects from our library. I'm going to highlight my mouse here. Remember, we're going to go up to the top, and we're going to go over here, and we're going to find this plus button. And this plus button opens our object library, and we're going to look for a slider. All right, so let's hit plus, and I'm going to type in SLIDER, and there it is. There's our little slider. And so let's make some room here. I'm going to click and drag this. We're going to drag it right over there. And as you can see, we are getting these great alignment tools. So let's first align it with our switch. And then let's align it vertically in our scene. And then horizontally right there. All right. Now, you may say that looks kind of goofy because the switch and the slider are so far away from each other. We're going to get to this in part 5, but we're going to work on our user interface a little bit. If you feel more comfortable moving your buttons closer in here to your slider, that's fine. There's no rules. Everything will work. So there we go. We have our buttons and then the corresponding slider. So this will be the red slider, the green slider, and the blue slider. So I'm guessing it's going to have us add the other two. So let's go back to our book. Repeat this. So each switch has a slider next to it. It should look like that. Let's go do that. So let's go up to plus. There's our slider. We're going to drag it over. Again, align it horizontal and center it vertically. Got it? And then let's add one more for a total of 3. And again, let's align it with our switch. And then right in the center, right there. All right, we can zoom in and kind of look at this. So there we go. We have 1, 2, 3 switches, and each switch has a slider. Perfect. All right, let's see what we do next here. Now it says drag or shift click to select all 3 sliders. In the attributes inspector, set the value to 1. All right, so a slider all the way here is 0, and all the way up here is 1. Halfway is 0.5, 0.25, right? So you're going between 0 and 1. What it's telling you is to preset this slider, so it's a 1, which I'm guessing is all the way full, right? So it says grab all 3 of them, so we can do all 3 at once. Set the attribute value to 1. Okay, so again, let's look over here. I'm going to click my mouse, and I'm going to drag a box around all 3 so I have all of them selected. And then let's go up here. Let me click on our attributes. And right there it says your slider has a value. Right now it's at 0.5, which is right in the middle. We want that to be a 1. So we're going to highlight that and change that to a 1. All right. And then when we click over here, we should see that each slider now is 100%. Perfect. So the buttons are going to start at off and the sliders are going to start at 100. Okay. Let's go back to our book. Now open your assistant code editor so you can see your view controller code. Control drag from each slider to the file to create outlets. Name them red slider, green slider, and blue slider. All right, so we're getting really good at this, creating outlets. So let's go back, and we want to create one red, green, and blue slider. Okay. Sorry about that. Okay. So here is our top one. Let me zoom in for us a little bit here. So I'm going to click on that. Now I'm going to hold Control or the right click button. I'm going to drag that over. Let's pop that right in here. Remember, this is an outlet. And we're going to call this red slider. And remember, it is a slider, UI slider. All right. Red slider, connect. Let's do our green slider. So hold Control, click and drag. We'll drop that right in here. Remember to change this to an outlet. We're making outlets. This is called green slider. Connect. And then let's select our blue. Hold Control, click and bring that over. Remember, that is an outlet. And this is BLUE capital S. Slider, blue slider. Connect. Okay, so we've gone through and we've had 3 outlets. Now the reason we need to do that is because the code is going to need to tell those sliders where to start when the app starts. So we need to connect the code to those sliders. As you can imagine, we also need to do the opposite, which is an action. Because when I take my finger and I perform an action on that slider by moving it up or down, the code needs to reflect that by changing the intensity of that color, right? So we are probably going to create our actions next, but let's zoom out. Again, you want to make 3 outlets, 1 for each slider. Let's go back to our book. Now, control drag from each slider to create outlets. We did that, step 6. So now we're on to step 1. Control drag from the top slider to create an action called slider changed. All right, and I'm guessing we only need to do this for 1 slider because the other 2 also are going to do this, so we'll probably connect them all. All right, control drag from the top slider, create an action called slider changed. So click our first slider here, control drag, we're going to drop it right in here, let go. Remember, this is an action, and we're going to call this slider, capital C, changed. And type UI slider. All right, and we're going to say connect. There we go. So we created the function. When we change the slider, it's going to send that information into the code so it knows what we're changing and how much we're changing it. All right, now let's go on to page 132. Now it says drag from the circle icon in the gutter by the new action to each of the other, to each of the other 2 sliders, one at a time, so all sliders are connected to the same action. All right. So what it's saying is down here, right next to this action, we've got this little circle in what's called the gutter. And it wants us to connect this not only to that first slider, but to the other 2 as well. So all 3 of them point back to this one function. We don't need to write 3 separate functions. All the sliders are the same. So we're going to click, and we're going to drag this over, and we're going to make sure that works on green slider. And then we're going to click and drag this over and drop it on our blue slider. And the way that you know that worked is if you hover over this, you can now see on the left side of the screen there that this one action applies to all 3 sliders, whereas it originally only was the red. Now it is all 3 because we just connected those. Okay, so again, remember, you click and you drag what you want to connect that to. All right, so perfect. Let's zoom out here. So we've created our actions and outlets. Now we got to write a little bit of code to say what these sliders do. All right. So let's go back. It says right here, we are at number 2. The slider changed action is simple. Just call update color. So what we're going to do is go back to our code. And what it's saying is, right here, when this slider changes, we want it to reference this update color function. So in between its brackets, I'm going to make a new line, and I'm going to call our function update color. Okay. So whenever we touch a slider and start to move it, it's going to update the color based on this function we wrote. Perfect. And that's for all 3 sliders. Okay. Let's go back to our book. It says, but the update color method needs updating. So we need to kind of tweak that a little bit now that we have sliders involved. Because currently it's just going to set it from 0 to 1. Well, we need to use those sort of in-between numbers now, those decimal numbers, right? So 0.25, 0.5, 0.75. And what we need to do is, let me slide in here. Remember, we wrote this code. If the red switch is on, red equals 1. But what we need to do instead is say, if the switch is on, look at where the slider's at and base the decimal point on where the slider's at. Is it halfway? Is it 3/4? So if the red switch is on, if we flip our switch on, then check the slider value and put the slider there. Okay. And again, you see this word CG float or float. That essentially stands for decimal point. It's not a whole number. It's not an integer. It is a decimal point. 0.5 is half. 0.75 is 3/4. So sometimes you need to get into the decimal points, and that's where you see this float come up. All right. So we need to add this code in. So it says update each line. So it uses the value of the slider, and it gives us the sort of option here for the red switch. So I'm going to do what we do. We're going to put our code down here. Let's bring up our Xcode. Let's kind of compare these. Okay. So let's zoom in here. It says if red switch is on, red equals CG float. Okay, so what we see up here is, and I'll bring up my mouse, if red switch is on, red equals 1. Well, it can no longer equal 1. We need to add the slider in. So we're going to change this. If red switch is on, red equals CG float, parentheses, red slider dot value, parentheses. Okay. So we changed that to make sure that the code also took into account the position of the slider, not just the switch, but also the slider. Now what we're going to do is we're going to go through and do that for the green and the blue. So if green switches on, green equals CG float, parentheses, green slider dot value. All right. So again, if our green switch is on, also look at the position of our slider. Finally, the blue switch is on. Blue equals a decimal point somewhere on the value. Blue slider dot value. All right. Let's clean this up a little bit here, and I'm going to zoom out. So what we did was we tweaked our code, right? Instead of just looking at the switch, we're now looking at our slider, that value. and it's a decimal point because it's somewhere between 0 and 1. And so we looked at the red, the green, and the blue switch, and also the red, the green, and the blue slider. Awesome. So let's go back to our book. Let's pull this up a little bit here. Okay. Now it says when you've updated the code for the green and blue switches, run the project again. You can now adjust the levels of each color component. Time to build and run. Let's see what happens. Let's wake this iPad up. Let's go over to Xcode here. And remember up top in the upper left-hand corner, that way, we have a play button. And that is our build and run button. Again, we're making sure we shoot that over to our iPad. So here we go. Build and run. Should shoot it over here to our iPad. Let's go pull our iPad up. Now you see on our screen, this looks good so far. We have our 3 buttons. We set those to start at 0. And we have our 3 sliders. We set those to start at 100%. Let's turn on the red. Now, it's going to look at the slider. The slider is 100% red. Let's slide. Oh, look at that. You see that? It is changing the intensity of that red. So all the way up is full red. All the way down is no red, black. Awesome. Let's turn on this slider here. So again, that's our green slider. Added together with the red makes a little yellow. Let's maybe... not as much green. We got like an orange there. We can maybe kill this red and bring in more of like a mustard color there. All right, this is so awesome. Let's add in our third color. That's our blue. Now we have a full intense blue that's giving us sort of a violet. We can kind of bring the blue down, maybe bring this yellow down. Let's get like a pink purple here. All right, let's add in all that red. Real vibrant, sort of neonish pink. Cool. So this is awesome. We are working through this app together, making sliders, switches, interacting with it. This is what it's all about. So congratulations if you've made it this far. You've got your sliders and buttons working. Your color is updating. You're finding your favorite color in here by moving these things around. You are awesome. And if you ran into a problem, you're still just as awesome. Something's just throwing you for a loop. So make sure you hit us up at TechTeacherSup on Twitter, or just comment in the video below and we'll help you out. We'll figure out what's going on, why you can't get here, and we'll get you to catch up. So congratulations on getting your sliders and switches, because we have one more thing to add, which is a button. And then we got to do a little bit of user interface stuff. So let's get our button in here. We're going to add a reset button. Because wouldn't it be nice if there was a button right here that we could click that would just reset everything back to 0? I think it would be. So let's add one. In fact, the book is going to make us add one, so we have no choice. But congratulations, we got our sliders, and not only did we get our sliders in, but they're working. The code you wrote is working. This is really cool. So I'm going to go back to our book, and here we are. And it's telling you, build and run your project. Make sure it works. Boom. We got it. Congratulations. We are on to 17.5, which is our reset button. And again, this is a button that just sits down at the bottom of your project. And when you tap it, it's going to switch everything back to the start. All right. So let's go in on this. Open main.storyboard and find a button in your object library. And I'm right here on the screen, about halfway down. Okay, and so we need to add a button. It says drag it onto your scene, use the guides to center it and place it near the bottom. Select the button and change its title to reset using the attributes. All right, we're going to add a button. We're going to call it reset. So let's go back over to our Xcode project. Here we are. Now remember, we need to add a UI object from our library. So we're going to go up and over here to our plus button. We're going to hit plus, and we are looking for a button, B-U-T-T-O-N, and there it is, button. And we're going to click and drag that, and it asks us where do we want to put it. We can use our guides to find the very center. We don't want to bury it at the very bottom of the screen. That might be hard to see, so let's bring it up just a tad. And there we go. And if we zoom in a little bit, we can see it's called button. Let's call it reset. Why don't we? So I'm going to click on my button. Okay. And I'm going to go over here to the right. And then I'm going to go up. And we're going to make sure we're on our attributes. All right. So these are all the properties of this button. What color do you want it to be? What font? How big? Do you want it to have a border? You can really make your buttons look really completely different using these attributes. But this is a standard Apple button. We don't need to mess with it too much, but we do want it to say what it's going to do. So I know when I click that button, it's going to reset. So that's what we're going to call it. So right here, you can see its title is button. Nope, its title is now reset. All right. And we're going to click over and we're going to zoom in and see that sure enough, it changed it to reset. So that's how you change what your buttons say. It's always a good practice to make sure that the button says what it's going to do. So if this button resets the board, you could even make it say reset board. You know, whatever you think it should be called, reset is a good start. So let's go back to our book here. It says add a button, call it reset. We did that. Nice work. Let's go on. And it says open the code editor, make sure it's viewcontroller.swift, then control drag from the button to create an action. Call the action reset, and it should look like this. All right, now, this is important. Again, it's another action. We are performing an action. We are clicking the button. So we need to write some code. When we hit reset, what happens? Well, we need to set everything back to 0. So we need to create an action on that reset button. So we're going to do that by control dragging over. We're going to call it reset, and it should write some code for us. So let's do that. Let's zoom in a little bit here. There's my reset button. I'm going to click on it. And now again, I'm going to hold control, and I'm going to drag from my button over here. And you know what? Let's just put it right in there. It is, remember, it is an action, and we're going to call it reset. And now here, touch up inside, that's called a touch event, a touch handler. When you put your finger down to hit a button, that's touch down. When you lift your finger off the button, that's touch up. So if you think about it, when you hit a button, you don't want the button to perform its action upon touching it, but upon releasing it, right? So that's what's called touch up inside. And again, that means inside the button, when you touch down and pull your finger up, it's going to perform this action. And it's going to perform this reset action is what we're going to call it, all right? Touch up inside. Click. Oh, it is a UI button. Important. Connect. Okay, so it says reset sender UI button. Perfect. It wrote some code for us. It got that action code in there, but now we need to say what does that action do. So it's going to perform an action of what? Let's write that code. Oh, and you know what? I actually did that wrong. Sender should be any object. Now I said UI button. I wonder if that's going to be a problem, but let's do it by the book. So I'm going to go back to my Xcode. This is a good example of what to do. If you just type some code in that's wrong or you messed up, remember you can always do undo. Now undo on a Mac is the command button plus Z, or you can also go up to your menu up here to the edit and say undo. So I'm going to undo that connection that we just did because I said it was a UI button, but it didn't want us to do that. I don't think it's going to be a problem at all, but let's do it by the book. So we're going to undo that connection. And as you can see, the code is still there. So I'm actually going to, me zoom in here. It deleted that connection. Let's see if we hit undo one more time, if it will delete the actual code. No. So we need to actually delete this code. So I'm going to highlight this chunk of code right here, and on my keyboard I'm going to hit delete. There we go. And we're going to add that action again. So this is a good example of sometimes you mess up, you got to undo, delete, re-add, right? Pretty normal stuff. So let's click on this reset button. We're going to control drag over again. Just put it right where it was. Remember, its name is reset. Type is any. So let's keep it at any. Don't switch it to button like I did. They don't want you to, so let's not do it. And remember, touch up inside. Again, that's when we lift our finger up off the button, it'll perform this reset. Connect. And there is our code. Reset any. Perfect. That looks better. So let's zoom out of this for you. And we're going to go back over to the book. And it actually says sender any object. We should probably do that. Sender any object. Just to be consistent. I don't want to go off a little bit and do my own thing, because then you'll be like, why is he not following the book? So let's follow the book. It works just fine this way too. So any object. Perfect. Let's see what the book wants us to do next. Open the connections inspector. You'll see the button has been connected to the touch up inside event. This is the standard event for most buttons. So yes. Now your reset button will set the value of each slider to 1 and the property of each switch to off. So when we hit reset, we want to perform two things. We want to say, go back to the beginning where every slider is at 100 and every switch is off. All right, because if you launch the app and want to get back to 0, you'd have to go in and move all the sliders and buttons yourself. This reset button will do it for us. So you've updated the switches and sliders using code, but you want the same behavior as if the user had done the switches themselves. So that's what the reset button is going to do. So to have that occur, we're going to have to call update color at the end of our method. So let's try this again. Let me highlight this because they don't do a good job of sort of breaking this out as an actual step you need to do, but the step is within the paragraph here. So your reset button will set the value of each slider to 1 and the is-on property of each switch to false. Add that code to the new action method. So that new code that got written, we have to add that in there. What does reset do? You've updated the switches and sliders using code, but you want the same behavior as if the user had changed the switches. When the user changes a slider or a switch, the color displayed on the screen updates. To have the same behavior occur when the reset button is tapped, add a call to update color at the end of the action method. So let's do this. I'm going to go back to Xcode, and we need to add that line, update color, to our reset button. So let's do that. Here in our reset button, here's our function. I'm going to hit enter to create a new line. I'm going to call update color, parentheses. All right. But this is tricky. It wants you to actually add some code right here, but it doesn't even tell you what code to add. You got to figure that out yourself. Your reset button will set the value of each slider to 1 and the is-on property of each switch to false. Add that code to the new action method. So let's do that. How do we set let's start. How do we set each slider to 1? Well, let's do that. Right up here. Let's see. Let's move that over. And we're going to say, let's just start with our sliders. So red slider equals 1. Blue, well, we'll do green next. Green slider equals 1. Blue slider equals 1. Red switch dot is on equals 0. False. Green switch is on equals false. Blue switch is on equals false. Update the color. Let's see. Red slider equals 1. Now we don't want the slider. We want the slider to equal 1 when we hit reset. So we'll say green slider, red slider dot value equals 1. Green slider dot value equals 1. And blue slider dot value equals 1. All right. Kind of figure that out on the fly here because they don't tell you in the book exactly what should be written. You need to problem solve a little bit and synthesize that and figure it out. So let's look at what we just did. Okay. The action is the tapping of the reset button. When the reset button is tapped, set the red slider to 1. Set the value of the green slider to 1. Set the value of the blue slider to 1. Set the red switch. Is it on? False. It's off. Set the red switch off. Green switch off. Blue switch off. And then update that to the color. All right. So essentially what we did is we just told every slider and every button to go back to how it should be when you first start it. To reset. Ooh, that was a lot of code. All right, that was fun. Let's go back to our book and let's see here. Build and run the app, set a color, then try our reset button. Oh boy, that's the end. Are you ready? Here we go. So we're going to build and run our app. So again, we go up here and see this play button. We're going to say build and run. All right. And when we do that, it should come over here to our iPad. So let's pull our iPad up. And let's turn on red and give it a little bit of red. Let's turn on green. A little bit of green here. Let's turn on some blue. All right. You know what? I want to reset back to 0. Let's click reset. Yeah. It worked. Congratulations. That was awesome. Let's try this again. Let's turn on the red. All right. Let's turn on a little bit of green. Pretty cool. Let's turn on a little bit of purple. Let's turn that red off. Actually, we don't need that. Let's try to match our tech teacher support blue up there. All right. And we have a gigantic truck right outside the studio here right now. Sorry about that. We're going to mix that right there. Okay. This is really cool. You know what? Let's reset back to 0. Reset. Boom. Congratulations. That is awesome. Not only do we have buttons, sliders, switches, we have a UI view. And then we can reset that and bring it all back to 0. That is really cool. Let's go back to our book and see what it says. Right here, summary. In this section, we've learned how to add a button. We added a reset button, how to use our connections inspector. Of course, we've already done that. And then what event is used for buttons. Boom. All right, we're up to polishing the interface. So we are going to stop there. Thank you for joining us. Let's build an app 4. We've made it all the way to the very end where we're going to polish this up a little bit and make it look good here on our iPad. Thank you for joining us. Thank you for coming along. I know this can be tricky, but you've done an amazing job. So if you have any questions, you can go to our Twitter at TechTeacherSup. You can also leave a comment right down here below on our YouTube channel, and we'll help you out there as well. So I want to say to join us for part 5. That will be polishing the interface, and that will be the last step. So congratulations. Thank you for joining us. Again, I'm Chris. This is Tech Teacher Support. Have a great day, and I'll see you soon. All right, bye.